Welcome everybody to the MasterCard Entrepreneurs Odyssey. So it's great to see everyone, and today we're going to be speaking about value creation and pricing. Those two things are really inextricably linked, as we will see. Price is of course what we charge, but value is what we create for ourselves and customers. I'm David Bell, and I've been working with entrepreneurs now for over 10 years, helping companies that I invest in at Idea Farm Ventures to think about this really critical decision of pricing. And our goal today is to really understand some fundamentals of pricing, and then of course also some key tactics and strategies that can be used, as well as ways to get data from customers that will help us make great pricing decisions. So in terms of where we're going to go over our first session together, let me just lay out the roadmap. We're going to start thinking about some preliminary ideas of value. And this is very, very specific. Value, of course, cannot be decoupled from price. You can't set a price, ideally, without creating value, both for yourself as an entrepreneur and also for the customers you serve. And as we'll see, oftentimes for other people who are involved in the process. They could be your distributors, your salespeople, your enablers, and so on. Secondly, we're going to start thinking about a pricing framework and some fundamentals that flow from that. So this will help you to construct what will hopefully be an optimal price range for the products and services that you're selling. And we'll get through those two things together. And then we'll take a little bit of a break and we'll get into some applications. How does one collect data to think about prices? And we'll also have a little bit of fun with what I'll call some pricing quirks, and you'll see what I mean by that when we get into it. And we'll actually conclude with some really fascinating ideas from two gentlemen who actually won the Nobel Prize. So that's our roadmap for today. So let's get right into it and think about the notion of value, what it is, how it's constructed, and how it's communicated to customers through price. So if you was to walk into a store, I guess a Walmart in this case, and you were to see a price of $0, clearly it's an unbeatable price. There's nothing better than free. But you might have a question as to what the value was of the goods or services that were being offered at that price. So again, just to really ram this point home, the notion of value cannot be decoupled from what is charged as a price. And we'll actually see as we get deeper into the material, even the specific numbers that we use make a difference to customers' perceptions of value. So in the Western world, or United States where I am in Los Angeles right now, certain endings are more common than others. So it's very common to see prices end in 9 and prices end in 5. And if you deviate from that, that may mean something different to customers as they try to understand what it is that you're doing with your pricing strategy. So we'll get to that a little bit later on. Okay, so value and pricing. Value is created and exchanged. So I produce a product or a service, or you as an entrepreneur produce a product or a service, and you want the recipient or the target of that product or service to perceive that it's valuable to them. And the way that you extract value is through the price that you charge, but the price is also a signifier of what is being offered to the customer. And sometimes in certain product categories, a higher price is actually preferred by customers than a lower price. For example, if you were going to go as an entrepreneur and hire an accountant or an attorney to do some work for you, you may not be purely focused on the price that that attorney was charging and wanting someone who had the lowest price, because the lowest price could in fact be a signal that that particular provider was not offering very, very high quality. So sometimes there's an interesting relationship where customers are willing to pay more for a product or service when price signifies value. Some really interesting data, I think, really just to whet our appetite for why price is so important. And if you're sitting there as an entrepreneur, you may have struggled with your team around how to set prices and also how to do so optimally. Now, unfortunately, price decisions are often taken very, very arbitrarily, and a lot of value is left on the table by entrepreneurs in the process. So just to really get a sense of what this means, I'd like you to look at this chart here prepared by McKinsey. And what McKinsey has done is they've looked at around 2,500 companies, and they've said, gee, if we could improve certain metrics for businesses and entrepreneurs, so help entrepreneurs reduce their fixed costs or increase their volume or reduce their variable costs or charge slightly higher prices, you know, which ones of those things would lead to the greatest improvement in incremental operating profit? And what they found, interestingly enough, is just being able to improve your price extraction by a small amount on average can lead to significant improvements in operating revenue. It could be because of the kinds of customers that you're attracting. It could be because of the margins. that you're making. It could also be because of the way customers are being retained. So this just really indicates to us from empirical data, from a large sample, that getting price right has a really profound impact on what happens with the profitability of your enterprise. Now, the flip side of that, unfortunately, when we think about ourselves as entrepreneurs, often we don't really know enough about some of the key variables that go into setting prices. Now, if you've been in the position as an entrepreneur of setting price for your products or services, of course you want to think about what the product costs. In some cases, you may want to price below marginal cost, but of course, this is not a sustainable thing to do over the long term. However, you typically should have a reasonable knowledge of what the variable cost of producing your product is, what the fixed costs are of operating your plant or your store or whatever else you're using to provide that product or service to customers. You've probably done a little bit of looking around to see what your direct and indirect competitors are charging. You may have done some intimate customer research to understand what value customers derive from your product. But in terms of figuring out how customers are going to respond, if you raise prices by 10% or you drop them by 20%, and in terms of figuring out, what the full range of acceptable prices is to customers, that's a different matter altogether. So you can see as you look at this chart, the inputs that entrepreneurs really don't understand very well are inputs related to the customer. What is a customer willing to pay? How will a customer react to changes in the products, the prices of the products and services I offer? So we're going to spend a fair amount of time on the customer view of pricing, because I'm going to assume that as an entrepreneur, you know what the product costs you to produce, you know what the service costs you to operate, and you also have some understanding of what competitors are doing. So with that in mind, let's have a little bit of a recap and a little bit of a sidebar. I know as entrepreneurs, it's really helpful to think of things in terms of integrated decision making. So price is just one thing that you're focused on. You're of course also thinking about the product that you're making or the service that you're offering, the way you're promoting that with the various messages and influences potentially that you're using, and finally the place or the channel through which you're selling it. It could be in a physical environment, it could be over the internet, or it could be a combination of the two. Now, the reason I'm putting this here, I'm assuming some of you, but perhaps not all of you, have heard of the famous 4 Ps of marketing. But the key point here is that whatever you set as a price should be consistent with the other things that you're doing. So if you're charging very, very high prices, you would probably not want to be distributing that product to a mass audience through a very mass channel that has customers that are relatively price sensitive, for example. So the key idea here is whatever happens with price doesn't happen in isolation. It happens with respect to those other decisions and is also reinforcing of those other decisions that you're making as an entrepreneur. And I thought just to really sort of wrap around and wrap up our preliminary of the relationship between value and price, we could look at one of the most famous investors, I guess, globally, and certainly here in the United States, our friend Warren Buffett. And you can sort of read the quote there, but the import of the quote is that pricing is absolutely critical to having a long-run successful business. And Warren Buffett says, hey, as an investor, if I look at a company where that company has some ability to set prices and customers are okay with those prices, I like that business as a company to invest in. If it's really, really difficult for entrepreneurs and managers to change prices, they really have no ability to create value for customers beyond charging just really low prices, probably I'm not going to be interested in that business. So again, hopefully you've got the message without me repeating it too much. Price is going to be absolutely critical to your success. And of course, anytime you change price, you can easily be emulated by your competitors. Anytime you change price, it has implications for your revenue and of course also for your profitability. Okay, so 2 complementary views for thinking about pricing as we go through the exercise here. Of course, the first view is on us as the entrepreneur. Price is a decision that we take to try and maximize profits. And as I said, it should reinforce the other 3 Ps of marketing: the promotional message, the kind of product or service that we're offering, and the channel through which that product is offered to customers. Now, secondly, we also have to think about the customer. So what is a fair or acceptable price to the customer, and how is that anchored by the perceived value that the product or service offers? And one really interesting trend that I've observed as an investor and previously as a professor working with entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurs now in the new economy are often more transparent about why they charge the prices that they do. So they may communicate to customers the reason this sweater is $50 is it costs $10 to procure the materials, it costs about $20 to make it. Of course, I have to, the entrepreneur has to pay the employees something and so on, and therefore I'm taking a $10 or a 20% margin on the product. So price has also become, in the digital economy, a means of communicating value with customers, and oftentimes a means of being transparent and building a brand that customers can really get excited about. Okay, with that in mind, let's now go into what I think is a really key framework that will help you understand how do I really sit down with my team as an entrepreneur and set a price that I know, number one, is going to create profit and value and revenue for me in the short run and the long run. And number two, a price that is going to be acceptable to my customers and in fact perceived as fair by my customers. How do I go about that? Now, we'll see later on after the break some methods that are more sophisticated in terms of understanding data, collecting data from customers, even if you wish to use various kinds of mathematical and statistical analyses. But for now, let's start with a framework, and a good framework can really help focus our thinking on the really key decisions that need to be made. So the framework I'm going to share first and foremost is a framework that helps us think about value-based pricing. And if you run through these steps in a cohesive way and you talk them through with your team, and ideally you have data to understand each one, you will in fact arrive at a price that, number one, generates revenue and profit for you, and number two is fair and acceptable for customers. So the first thing we have to think about is the price floor, the cost factors. Now, of course, I'm going to put a big X with my hand in the air here. You typically never want to do what's called cost plus pricing. What I mean by that is if the marginal cost of my product is $20, I don't simply say, well, I'd like to make a 50% increment on that, let me charge 30. That's, of course, a starting point, but you never, ever end there. So you'll often see, if you've taken basic classes in economics, you may learn about cost plus pricing, you may know that term. It's a good starting point, but it's never, never the finish, because it only really considers one single input, which is the cost of the product to make. And that's only the starting point, it's not the ending point. So we start with the price floor, which is determined by cost factors. We then see how high we can go to a ceiling. What are the customer factors? So it's a very, very hot day, let's say in Dubai, and our friend Mariam is really, really thirsty and she hasn't drunk anything for the entire day. I may be able to charge her $10 for a can of Coca-Cola just because at that moment she's extremely thirsty and she has no other options and she's willing to pay it. Well, could I really do that though? Can I always get to the ceiling? Well, not necessarily, because sometimes there might be a competitor down the street that's offering the product for $2, so immediately I'm going to have to drop. So what we'll see in this diagram is there are things that cause the floor to be raised. You have to charge prices that are higher than your marginal cost. And there are other factors that cause the ceiling to collapse, meaning that you can't always charge the maximum that you can extract from a customer. And of course, for equity reasons, you may not want to do that either. So what is it that raises the floor of the price? Well, there are company factors. We may want to have a certain internal rate of return. There are also related channel and collaborative factors. If I'm selling a product through a channel of distribution, that channel also has to make a margin. So those two considerations cause the price to increase from just purely the cost floor. The ceiling, as I indicated earlier, also potentially comes down because of competitive alternatives. And what we arrive at in the middle here is a range that allows us to create a final pricing decision. So I'll give a fun example that comes from the world of business-to-business marketing. And it's really interesting because oftentimes in business-to-business marketing, you're dealing with things that are effectively commodities. So a famous chemical company in the United States, I won't give the name, came up with a revolutionary product that would allow manufacturers of small metalworking devices to effectively regenerate the fluid that they had to use in the factories to keep the machines running. Now, the cost of this product to make was about 50 cents, but if you actually calculated from the customer end of things, the economic value to being able to regenerate that fluid over an annual basis was about $40. So there was a huge spread from the 50-cent cost to the $40 value to the customer. But the reason you couldn't charge $40 is because competitor alternatives could do the same thing for about 18. And the reason you wouldn't want to set the price at just a little bit over 50 cents is in order to sell this, you had to use distributors to do it, and they needed to make a margin. So in this particular case, the company went from a spread of 50 cents to $40 and quickly collapsed to $6 to 18. So if you go through this exercise, this will allow you to construct a range that will start to give you a feeling of where the price should be intuitively. Now, we're going to get more detailed in terms of techniques to really help us do this, but for now, if you go through this exercise of thinking through these 4 factors and you do it really carefully and consistently, you will arrive at a range for your final pricing decision. Now, to give a little bit of texture to things that cause prices to be able to go up or go down, really focusing here on the ceiling, because remember from our previous slide, the ceiling is determined by factors to do with the customer. What are the factors that entrepreneurs have the least knowledge about? In my experience, and also according to the study by the authors of Power Pricing, is factors to do with the customer. So let's dig into 4 or 5 here to really make this tangible. So if you're in a product or a service market and your customer is aware of substitute options, is that going to make them more price sensitive, meaning the ceiling comes down, or is it going to make them less price sensitive, meaning the ceiling goes up? So every thought experiment we'll do will only have 2 options. So in this case, if your customer is aware of substitutes, that's going to make them more price sensitive, that they can easily change to something else if they don't take your option. So awareness of substitutes is a factor that's going to cause the ceiling to depress a little bit. The second thing that you want to think about, is it easy for the customer to make direct price comparisons between you and competitors and other kinds of status quo alternatives? If the answer is yes, if price comparisons can easily be made directly, that is going to increase the price sensitivity of the customer, and it's going to cause the ceiling on what you charge to collapse a little bit. Now, I'm sure most of us here together going through this course have had the experience of going into a supermarket almost anywhere in the world. And in certain countries, the United States is one, the United Kingdom is another, many supermarkets have their own private brands, private label brands, and often what they'll do is they'll have the Johnson & Johnson shampoo or the Tylenol, and right next to it, there'll be the brand that's produced by the store that if you're very careful and you look at the ingredients, they're effectively the same thing. And by placing those products together, and this one is $5.99 and this one is $3.99, it makes it really easy for the customer to opt in to the private brand. Now, the retailer has an incentive to switch customers to those brands and to, in fact, make the direct comparison of prices more salient, which increases the price sensitivity of customers. So those 2 factors will drive down the ceiling. Now, is there anything that can be done to push up the ceiling? Well, here is an example of a young lady who's heading off to college and she needs to buy a whole bunch of things. And imagine that all we're doing is we're selling her a t-shirt that's part of her laptop, her books, and all the other things that she has to pay for when she goes to college. So if your product is part of a relatively small bundle of things, or your service is part of a relatively small bundle of things that the customer is buying, then the customer is going to look at that and say, well, gee, relative to everything else I'm spending, this one particular item is not so expensive. So whether it's $10 or $15, that really doesn't matter too much to me. And that's going to raise the ceiling and make the customer less price sensitive. So it's the same kind of thing. Any of you there as entrepreneurs who've gone out and tried to buy an automobile, as I thought about doing recently in Los Angeles, although truth be told, I'd rather do without an automobile. When you go to buy an automobile, the car dealer may say to you, she or he, well, sir, if you add this new stereo to your car, it's only another $1,000. And you might think, well, $1,000 is a lot of money in absolute terms, but taken in the totality of spending $20,000 on a car, it seems like it's not that much. Therefore, you become less price sensitive and you're more willing to spend $1,000 in that setting than you would be in other settings. Okay, let's think of another factor that works in the same direction. This is a real boon for an entrepreneur. If you as an entrepreneur are selling a product to somebody where that person is not directly responsible for making the payment, often that makes the customer less price sensitive and increases their willingness to pay. So if the customer you're focused on is traveling in first class or business class, or they're dining out with clients, and the ultimate payer of the product is not that target individual themselves, but it's the firm that they work for or some other entity, that of course is going to make the customer less price sensitive and therefore raise the ceiling. Now, just as we're going through this, of course, we could continue to construct more and more examples, and I'll do a couple more on the next slide. But what I'd really like you to do is to sit down with your teams, and after you've nailed the cost, you've thought about what company and collaborator factors are going to cause your price to be higher than just your base cost, really then to focus on that top line, what is moving price sensitivity up and down, and to list as many factors, it'll actually be a fun exercise to do with your team, as many factors that relate to your product and your service that cause that ceiling either to go higher or to drop and to come lower. Now, before we go in and we take a break and we go into the more technical, if you will, aspects of how does one then get data to do pricing, I'd like you also to think about other things that price may do in terms of communicating a certain value or a certain concept to customers. So the idea that price is a signal. Now, price as a signal becomes most important when customers really don't have such a great idea about what the product should really cost. So any of you there in the audience who've gone out recently and you've thought about getting engaged, and maybe you want to go and buy some jewelry for your significant other, probably unless you're an expert in diamonds, you really don't know what a diamond should cost. And so when you walk into a particular store and everything in that store is expensive, and the salesperson that you're talking to is telling you, well, can you really put a price on love and all of these things, that may cause you to become less price sensitive in that environment. Or if we take another example, a more prosaic one, since we started with Walmart with that price of $000, you might have noticed if you've shopped at all, for example, in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, and you go into a retail store, most things that you're buying, the price often ends in a 9 or it ends in a 5. But have you ever noticed, if you've had this opportunity or even gone to walmart.com, they might be selling paper towels for $1.87, and they might be selling detergent for $3.14, and all these slightly unusual prices. Well, what Walmart is trying to do in that instance is to communicate to you as a customer that they've literally squeezed every last penny out of the price to give you the greatest possible value. So price as a signal. One of my other favorite examples, again, comes from a retail setting, and I think it's one that we can relate to. So another store, you can look this up online if you've not had the opportunity to shop there. If I were to go shopping in Los Angeles at a store called Trader Joe's, which many of you will know, Trader Joe's is known to have great private label products. So Trader Joe's tamales, if you like eating Mexican food, or Trader Joe's dumplings. And I'll buy the tamales, as I did the other day, and they were $5.99. Now, it's difficult for me as a customer to know whether that pack of tamales at $5.99 really is a fair price or not. Now, why is that? Well, because it's not easy for me to find that exact same product in another store. It's only sold by Trader Joe's. So Trader Joe's knows that you know that I know that there's a problem of figuring out whether, in fact, Trader Joe's is a fairly priced store. So what do they do to signal? Well, they take a product that's really common. So it could be Poland Spring as the brand name of water, or Crystal Geyser. So bottled water that many, many people buy when they go shopping, and bottled water that's available in all kinds of other supermarkets in the Los Angeles region. And they price that bottled water at a really, really low price. So when you see this low price for a product that you know is available everywhere, you start to think to yourself, well, the other products that I can't compare must also be of good value, because the one that I can compare is priced so low to everything else. So again, as we go into our break, I'd really like you to think with your team all of the ways in which price is a communicator of value, is a signal, is getting into the mind and the psychology of the customer in a way that's favorable for you and for your business. As you'll see, there's much, much more to price than just the number that you put on the product or service. So with that in mind, we'll take a break here and we'll come back soon and we'll look at more of the technical details. But for now, I hope you have the concepts of price and value and the framework and all of the interesting things that price does firmly in mind.